Hi.
Hello.
Hello, how are you doing? Can someone send me the slide of decks? I cannot get access anymore. I don't know what's going on with my computer. Hello? Can someone send it to me, please? I'm having problems to log in now.
Hello, hello.
Hi.
Glad to be here. Looking forward to this meeting.
Oh, thank you. Me too. I'm looking forward to it. Okay, so looks like I'm already. I can get access again. Dios mío. Okay, now it goes. All right, so are we ready to start? Hi, Suzanne. Hi, Whitney. Very nice meeting you. So yeah, I'm going to hit the button. Okay. Oh my gosh, can someone start from the Energy Innovation account? Oh, no, I can do it now. Okay. Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's event. We are going to give a couple of minutes until people start coming in. My name is Diana Sweetler, and I'm very excited to be the moderator for today's event, the role of financial institutions in deep decarbonization. Before starting, I would like to take a few moments for housekeeping. We'll be running for 1 hour and 15 minutes for Q and answers at the end. I encourage everybody to leave questions in the main chat at any time. And we will also run 2 polls during this session, so I encourage your participation. Going to start sharing my screen now. Okay, here we are. So while we wait for the rest of the audience to arrive, I would like to speak briefly about the organization behind this event, Energy Innovation Network. Energy Innovation Network is a non-profit, global non-profit powered by volunteers working in the intersection of high-tech industry and the energy industry. EIN mission is not only about connecting people across sectors, it is also about educate and promote education and innovation to advance to a more sustainable future. EIN is a very diverse nonprofit with more than 5,000 members from every continent. And this is the 3 main pillars we work on: energy, technology, and sustainability. And EIN is a very diverse nonprofit with more than 5,000 members from every country, as you can see here. And it is a volunteer-based team. Professionals are coming from the renewable energy industry, top-tier universities, and top-notch consulting firms. This is our team of volunteers. We have 20 people in the board. And we also have our advisory board and our board member. This is what we do. We offer educational programs and events and webinars, among others. And for these events, we count with the invaluable help of our event partners, which are global corporates, NGOs, and higher education institutions. So now we go to our event. The decarbonization of the economy is one of the main topics of discussion today, and the finance sector plays a key role in achieving this goal. We have today 2 experts who will help us to understand why. Whitney Mann for the Center for Climate Aligned Finance and Susan Hinson from the Green Finance Institute. Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for your time today. Before getting into proper introductions, I would like to ask a question to the audience. Let me see here. Oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry. Well, it is okay. It is not working the polls today. So I'm going to start with introduction for Whitney Mann. Is a manager in the Center for Climate Aligned Finance Alignment Insights team, where she enables financial institutions by aligning their investing and lending decisions with climate goals. Prior to this, Whitney worked with Rocky Mountain Institute's Climate Finance Access Network to improve access to climate finance in less developed countries. Whitney also worked at NIRA Economic Consulting, supporting utilities, regulatory commissions, and governments in designing and implementing markets and auctions for energy procurement, environmental protection, and climate change mitigation. Whitney, welcome. Again, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Diana. Thanks, Energy Innovation Network. Excited to be here. I think, Diana, you have my slides. Is that right? Are you going to be progressing those?
I can do that, definitely. Okay.
Okay, perfect. So nice to meet you all. I'm Whitney Mann, manager at Center for Climate Aligned Finance, like Diana mentioned. If you go to the next slide here, just a quick intro on what the Center for Climate Aligned Finance is. So the Center for Climate Aligned Finance is a program within RMI, formerly the Rocky Mountain Institute. And at the center, we are specifically focused on the role of private financial institutions in the transition to net zero. So RMI more broadly focuses on decarbonization. We're a nonprofit think tank that's been around for, I think we just celebrated maybe even our 50th anniversary. I should know that, 40 to 50 years, focusing on transitions We have the electricity team, mobility team, industry team, so focusing on the transition across the real economy, and then RMI is focused on Center for Climate Aligned Finance is focused on the role of finance within that. And the financial sector is really critical to decarbonization because the way that money is invested, the types of projects and companies that money flows to, enables different types of assets and companies to exist. So we think about climate aligned finance, things like a $50 million bank loan for a solar project, or if you had $10 million venture capital check for innovative climate technologies or new climate startups, or even a $1 billion corporate bond for a large European steel maker to build a hydrogen-based steel plant. All of these are examples of how finance can be a catalyst for climate action. So with the center, we focus on the real economy. So that's a term I'll probably use today. I'm going to talk about real economy sectors, referring to things like power, transportation, buildings, industry, and so on, and whether the assets and companies that make up those sectors are electrified and running on clean energy. So these details on the rest of this slide will hopefully make more sense after I get into some more details, but our work at the center and with financial institutions is focused on supporting institutions at the firm level, at the sector level, and helping shape the operating environment. So that's how we talk about our work broadly, but I'll circle back to that. Next slide, please. So first I want to talk about sort of just where the sort of macro view of climate aligned finance and how did we get where we are today? And really we're here because of the convergence of two forces. So one is the expectations on financial institutions about their role in the transition. So questions around how should the private financial sector be involved in the transition to net zero, and recognizing that those expectations have changed over time. So they started as perhaps do no harm. Financial institutions through their lending and investing decisions should not be having harm on the environment. And then they moved more into do some more green investments, funnel more capital into green assets, then disclose the risks of your portfolio. So how are physical and transition risks from climate change impacting your bottom line? And then more into stop financing high carbon assets. So not wanting finance to go to support fossil fuel assets. And then next slide, please. So in addition to expectations on the financial sector, on the other hand, we also have a change within the financial sector, where at the center we think we've reached an inflection point. So financial institutions themselves are under unprecedented pressure from their shareholders, their employees, their clients, the media, to take some action. So we have convergence of these two forces. And next slide, please. The result we see of this inflection point is an idea that we call climate alignment. And so what does climate alignment mean? If you look at this chart here, climate alignment is the idea that it's not enough to just build more low carbon assets. Of course, we do need to do that. We need to have more wind, more solar, but we can't just have more wind and solar. You also need to transition all the high emitting assets in the real economy. So all the steel plants, all the trucks, all the LNG export terminals, we need to transition those while we're building more green technologies. And so the result would be a transition of the economy, as you see here, down to fully low carbon assets by hopefully 2050. So next slide here. So the other side of sort of related idea in climate alignment is, what does this new paradigm mean for financial institutions? So if I'm a financial institution and I'm making loans and investing to different assets, the question is, what are the emissions of my portfolio associated with the types of financial decisions that I've made? So we call this the portfolio emissions or financed emissions. So if you think about makeup of your portfolio, how could you represent those in carbon emissions? And how does the financed emissions of your portfolio today compared to what that of a climate aligned portfolio would look like? And so that's sort of how the role of the financial sector maps to this idea of climate alignment, that the emissions of the economy over time are going down to net zero, and then financial institutions' actions are in line with that. So next slide, please. So the idea here is that associated with the transition, there's a massive financing need, and that financing need also presents a massive opportunity for financial institutions. So this shows the amount of investment that would be needed, I think it's in each decade, or in a given year in that decade, by sector and by technology. So just giving an example of the types of things that we're going to need to finance and the capital commitments that would be required to transition. So between now and 2030, the capital commitments are increasing. So that's the left two bars on the sector chart. And then from 2030 to 2050, we see that the technology mix or the types of things that we need to invest in to have a climate-aligned pathway start to change. So we need more investments in renewables, in energy efficiency, and hydrogen, just to name a few. And then the capital deployments that financial sectors would need to be focusing on are changing over time as well. Next slide, please. So these figures on the next two slides, so the slide and the next one, are from a report from the center called Coming into Alignment. We came out with this last summer. So take the figures here with a grain of salt because they're about a year old and things are changing really quickly. But the idea of showing this slide and what I wanted to illustrate was that financial institutions are really starting to acknowledge their role in climate alignment. So this idea of climate alignment has been taking root over the past few years. And one of the ways that we can see that is the penetration of net zero commitments across regions. So as of last year, we see that nearly 40% of the financial institutions that we surveyed, at least in North America, so we're looking at some of the largest financial institutions only, but 40% of those in North America had a commitment to net zero, and 65% of those surveyed in Europe likewise had committed to net zero, so a bit more momentum in Europe than in North America. And so these are commitments, in other words, for these financial institutions to bring their emissions over time down to zero. We did an update of the research last quarter, so we know that now if you're looking at the 100 largest financial institutions globally, so that would include asset managers, asset owners, banks, and insurers, we know that nearly 70% of the largest have committed to net zero. So there's a lot of momentum, and you can think about commitments to net zero as a sort of indication of, okay, we recognize that we have a role to play in this climate alignment paradigm. Next slide, please. So this is also from that report. And what this shows is that if you start to look beyond sort of today, look beyond the number of firms with net zero targets, so these commitments to say where they'll be in 2050 per se, and you start to work backwards to how do you get to that commitment. So we have 2050 commitment, we have last year 74 firms with net zero targets. And then only 30 firms had pledged to make interim targets. So a target to say, here's where our finance emissions will be in 2030 on our way to net zero in 2050. So you can start to have sort of this line. Then you have even fewer who have actually set those interim targets. So you start to see, as you kind of like drill into the details, fewer and fewer institutions have said how they're going to get to this net zero by 2050, even if they have the high level commitment. So when we get to implementation, there's quite a big question mark. Financial institutions have pledged where they're going through these targets, but the big question is how will they get there? Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay. So to summarize here, we know that finance is critical to the energy transition. We know we'll need $4 trillion in new investment annually by 2030 to meet the financing needs of the transition. So that was that chart with the sectoral investment. And the IEA, the International Energy Agency, had estimated that no less than 70% of clean energy investments will need to come from private sources, so private financial institutions. Meanwhile, we know that investors are ready to step up. So we have at least 150 trillion in global assets has been pledged to net zero by 2050. And that represents 46% of global wealth. We have more and more financial institutions pledging to align their entire lending and investment portfolios with net zero goals. But the other thing that is certain is that none of them know how to achieve this. So you can click one more time. Diana, can you just click one more time? It should be, there we go, perfect, thank you. So At the center, we've identified 5 key challenges that financial institutions face being able to climate align their portfolios. So we're working to break those down and to help financial institutions overcome them. The first barrier that we've identified is that in order to actively support decarbonization, financial institutions need to understand these complex and often conflicting sectoral decarbonization pathways. So these are pathways that are developed by groups like IEA, pathways that basically say how the real economy will change over time. And in order to get started, financial institutions need to choose one of these pathways to benchmark their own efforts against. So that can be difficult. There are also a number of different methodologies and tools for assessing alignment and for reporting against your progress over time. And while a lot of these tools exist, none of them is perfect. None of them applies to all asset classes or types of financial institutions. So a lot of coordination to do there. There's also challenges with data. So the availability and quality of data that financial institutions would need in order to make progress on their climate alignment goals are not necessarily sufficient to assess alignment with climate targets. There's also a sort of first mover disadvantage for financial institutions who could risk losing clients and investment opportunities to competitors if they step too far ahead of peers, so a need for sort of industry coordination there. And lastly, due to an insufficient supply of investable assets that are aligned with climate targets, it may not even be possible for large financial institutions acting alone to align their portfolios with climate targets today. It's just some of the ways that the path forward is unclear. Next slide, please. So now with that background, that brings us back to our mission and vision at the Center for Climate Aligned Finance. So our mission at the center is to accelerate the private financial sector's transition to net zero. This is built on our vision that by 2030, 1.5 the economy can be a reality, with all major global financial institutions on track with their commitments. And to play our part in ushering this reality, the center's goal is to support 100 of the world's largest financial institutions to execute net zero alignment strategies through one or more of the center's solutions or work areas, and get to at least 90% of finance across the 7 key sectors that we've identified and are working on, signed up to climate alignment agreements. So next slide, please. So another way to think about our work is that we're solving for 3 areas of disconnect in particular to help overcome these broader challenges. The first area is that firm level commitments, so these net zero by 2050 commitments, too often do not translate to investor or lender decisions. So firm level commitments could be made as a result of stakeholder pressure, and the decision might be taken from the top with peers crowding in. But there's naturally then a disconnect between the commitments that are being made and the money managers who will actually need to steer portfolios. So really bringing the commitments in line with how capital allocation decisions are made within a financial institution is one key area of disconnect. Similarly, we have portfolio alignment approaches are often too focused on aligning emissions on paper. So how to change the portfolio composition or your finance emissions rather than taking a role in financing the real world transition. So more rooting of what do we need to finance in order to meet the sort of net zero goals in the real economy rather than just get to net zero on paper. And I think one area where this really comes up and is interesting is an example of divestment. We're divesting from high emitting companies rather than using engagement or innovative financing mechanisms like sustainability linked loans can lead to portfolio decarbonization rather than real economy decarbonization. So whereas in some cases divestment may be appropriate, it can also lead to higher emissions. For instance, if the investor who steps in to fill the gap left by the divestor doesn't have any climate commitments or intention to responsibly manage that asset. And the final area of disconnect is understanding how constituent efforts, so how the efforts by individual firms lead to a larger sum of effort. So often we see that peers across financial institutions don't really understand one another's approaches or the complementary roles that they can and should be playing. So there's a certain need for coordinating how individual efforts all sum up to this broader shared goal of net zero by 2050 across the real economy. Next slide, please. So in order to achieve our goals, the center works through both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. So our alignment insights team supports what we'd say the firm-level operating environment needed to execute on alignment strategies. And then we have a sectoral team that's working more on the bottom-up agreements at the sector and client level to drive decarbonization. The center has also recently acquired a group called PACTA, P-A-C-T-A. They're working on mainstreaming standardized tools for measuring and evaluating portfolio alignment. So that sort of cross-cuts between our top-down and our bottom-up approaches. I just have a quick slide on these three elements next. So next slide, please. So alignment insights. This is our top-down approach. Our alignment insights team consists of 3 core work streams, and we're producing resources on a sliding scale from open source through our thought leadership and systems analysis work to more bespoke solutions through our advisory work. And our advisory work is more tailored to specific institutions. So our alignment insights team overall is more thinking about, as I said, system level and firm level operating environment. So what does an institution need, and what does the sort of regulatory or operating environment that they're working within need to provide for them so that they're able to make progress on their net zero goals. And so cross-cutting this work on the system side is also our FinReg work, which focuses on regulatory research and assessments, and that really cross-cuts across the different work streams. Next slide, please. And then for decarbonizing sector, so this is our bottom-up work, our sectoral work is focused on convening key stakeholders to develop sector-specific decarbonization pathways. And these are pathways that banks can then report progress on decarbonization against. So more specifically, how do these work? We're bringing together, say, the top 5 or so lenders in a particular sector, and then they come together to sort of hammer out what decarbonization in that sector for banks should look like. So what should be the metrics that we use, or how often should we be disclosing progress, or what's the scope of the sector that we want to be looking at. So these working groups are bank-led and industry-backed and very much rooted in data to figure out what is the right decarbonization pathway that these institutions should be taking over time, what are the right metrics to report against those pathways. And so the result of these working groups are climate-aligned finance agreements, or CAF agreements. So at the center, we're currently working on this in steel, cement, aluminum, aviation, and real estate. And all of these working groups are modeled after the success of the Poseidon Principles, which was the first example of a climate-aligned finance agreement in shipping. So this brought together a number of lenders. There were 27 as of 2022, so we keep adding signatories to the agreement. And now nearly half of the global senior shipping debt is represented within the Poseidon Principles. So basically half of the debt that is going to the global shipping sector has agreed to the decarbonization pathway. And then you sort of create that, overcome the barriers such as first mover alignment, because everyone is on the same page about what the decarbonization pathway should look like. And then last slide next here, this is on our PACTA work for alignment data. Next slide, please. Perfect, thanks. So this is the PACTA work I mentioned, and PACTA came to RMI very recently from 2DII, 2 Degrees Investing Initiative. And PACTA is an open source data tool used by something like, I think, 3,000 financial institutions around the world to measure the climate alignment of their portfolio. So we know that data is a key barrier, and PACTA is working on helping financial institutions understand the climate alignment of their loans. Regulators can also use PACTA to understand how financial institutions that they oversee are also progressing on climate, or how they might be exposed to climate risks. So PACTA is the only tool that is forward-looking and that's available to measure alignment progress. And so we're excited that they're part of our team now. And I think that is the last slide. I just have my contact information up here. But I think with that, I will pass back to Diana and Susanna for their presentations, and then I think we open up for Q&A. But thank you.
Thank you, Whitney. It was really interesting to know more about the progress and the challenges of the financial institutions in climate alignment of the portfolio investments. We are going to do a little break with a poll to ask the audience a very simple question, which is, I don't know if you guys can see now, but the question is, what is green finance? So there are 4 options. The first one is green finance is the same as ESG investing. Second one, green finance involves divesting from fossil fuels. The third one is green finance uses finance to protect environment. And the next one is green finance focus on finance for mitigation rather than. Okay, so we are seeing the answers chipping in. We are going to leave a couple of minutes, or maybe a minute. Okay, already. So we are going to end the poll now. Okay, so the winner is the third one. Green finance uses finance to protect environment and managing how the environmental impacts. I'm sorry, green finance uses finance to protect the environment and managing how the environmental impacts finance. So I'm going to leave Suzanne to answer this question.
Yeah, it was very hard to make a poll in which the answer isn't awfully obvious and that everyone just gets 100%. So some of them are a little bit misleading because green finance does involve divesting from fossil fuels to a certain extent. But I think what I wanted, and you know, there are overlaps with ESG as well. So sorry if anyone got caught out, but the idea with green finance, which I'll talk through a bit more in my slides when I open them, is that it's about both greening the financial system as a whole, and that involves products like taxonomies, things like that, TCNFD, TCFD, but also moving money into the sectors, just as Whitney was talking, all those different real economy sectors that we need decarbonisation in. So I'll cover that a bit more in my slides, but it's a big area and green finance is just one bit of it.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for your answer. I'm going to give a proper introduction for you as you deserve. So Suzanne Atkinson is a research associate at the Green Finance Institute, focused on sector-specific green finance and policy development. Susanna has a background in energy policy and worked alongside and for the British Parliament, advising on legislation, debates, policy, and constituency issues. Susanna has worked on several key energy issues that have drawn the attention of Parliament, such as the net zero decarbonisation target, the Brexit, including the UK's departure from the European Union internal energy market, emissions trading scheme, and Euratom, and more recently, the 10-point plan and energy white paper. Besides her role in Parliament, she has worked with the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, also called BASE Committee on Energy Networks, Energy Efficiency and Clean Growth, as well as with the Climate Change Committee on the 6th Carbon Budget. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for being here with us today. The floor is yours, and I think you can share your own screen.
I thought you had my, do you have my slides?
I do have, and I will be very happy to
Great, thank you.
share them. Okay. There they are.
Perfect, thank you. So as that was a very generous introduction, thank you. I think we can skip to the next slide. So thank you. So it was really great to hear from Whitney about climate alignment in general. I'm going to zoom out a little bit to talk about green finance in general, and then zoom in to talk about some of the products we're working on at the Green Finance Institute. But just some background on the Green Finance Institute to start off with. We're UK based. I'm joining you from London, where it's the evening over here. It's good morning to all of you. Unlike the RMI, we are much younger. We are about to celebrate our 3rd birthday. We were set up by the UK government and the City of London Corporation out of the back of the government's Green Finance Strategy, which was published in 2019. The idea of us is to be an interface between the public and private sectors. We're backed by government and we're largely led by bankers. I'm a bit of an anomaly in the team that I have a policy background. The mission is to accelerate the transition to net zero, to the clean, resilient and environmentally sustainable economy we all want to see. And we're doing that by trying to channel capital at pace towards real economy outcomes. We're not a think tank, we're trying to develop products that happen in the real world and move real money. So we operate under 2 pillars of that green finance strategy that I mentioned. 2 of them are listed on here. The first is financing green, and that is moving money into those sectors that Whitney was talking about: transport, buildings, nature, moving the capital that's needed for the net zero interventions in those sectors. Then the second is greening finance, and that is supporting the greening of the financial system. So that's things like the taxonomy, TNFD, TCFD, things like that. And the third, which isn't on my slide, but is poignant to this meeting today, is capturing the opportunity is the policy phrase. And that's because the UK government recognises that green finance isn't just a topic that the UK should be interested in. It's a globally important topic because we need all the economies around the world to transition to green finance. And that's why conversations like that organised by the Energy Innovation Network today are so important, so we can share learnings and overlap what we're doing to make sure we're all on the same page and moving forward together. Next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So as I said, I'm going to zoom out a little bit to talk about green finance in general and where it fits within that wider array of things that maybe tripped you up in the poll. So I see this as a bit of a spectrum. So one end in the extreme, we have low carbon and net zero. And this is about mitigation. Any investment in any measure that removes emissions that would have been produced. Then the next level up is climate. And that's where you add in adaptation, because we all know that adaptation is as important as mitigation for addressing climate change. Then one level out from that is green, and this is where I think green sets. So there's a big focus on climate, but there's other green aspects that could be plugged into it too. So it may include, for example, the air quality of your local area, or forest rejuvenation, or things that don't necessarily have a direct impact on emissions or on adapting to climate change, but they do improve the environment in general. So that's sort of the broader umbrella of what we see in our institute as green and what we focus on financing. Then one level above that is ESG, and that's because the green sits in that environmental bracket just under the E, but they've added the S and the G to make a much bigger issue that we don't often work in, but there are clear overlaps, which I'll come back to later, especially on the social side, because the S is social and the G is government. So governance. So there are overlaps between the 3. And finally, the big umbrella that we're all trying to work towards is sustainable, and that has a much bigger remit. We know there's the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable has connotations to do with sort of being sustainable economically and things like that. But again, green is an important part of that. So just to recap that definition on the bottom left, we work with the Chartered Banking Institute in the UK, and this is the definition of green finance that we work to. So it's any process, product or service that is either destined to protect the natural environment or manage how the environment impacts finance and investment. Next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So I feel like Whitney did a great job of highlighting the fact that this is a big thing and the direction we need to go in to be climate aligned. So there's a lot of numbers on this slide. I won't talk through them all, but I'll pick out a few key ones. So the first is the top left, which highlights the growth of the green finance market over the last decade or so. So it started around, well, didn't start, but it was at about 5 billion in 2012, and it's now at more like 540 billion. So that just shows the growth in this. It's no longer a niche area that is maybe a fashion or a fad. This is really the future of investment that's got a huge growth potential. The other one to pick out here is the top right, which is about green bonds. So the green bond market has been very successful, has dominated green finance to date. 93.1% of green finance has been green bonds. There's a few reasons for this. There's clear green bond principles. They're perhaps a more amenable type of finance to green investments. But what we need to see next in green finance is a bigger breadth of products expanding beyond green bonds. And why this is all important is because the UK, well, it says on the slide, became the first major economy to commit to, in law, to net zero emissions by 2050. There's some debate about that. I think some of the Nordics may have got there before us. It depends what you define as a major economy. But we're very proud of our Climate Change Act that came into force in 2008. It's great to see it being replicated around the world. But there's no point having this target if we don't meet it. And to achieve the ambitious target, as Whitney was saying, the IEA have pointed out, we need to mobilise private finance. And that's why the UK government published its Green Finance Strategy in 2019. An update is coming out later this year. We're working with them on it. And they've also published a net zero strategy to try and mobilise all these numbers we're seeing on the left in the right direction. Next slide, please. So this is just a bit more information about what the GFI does, the Green Finance Institute does, and then I'll dive into some of our products a bit more. So on the Financing Green side, we convene these sector-based coalitions to look at what the barriers are to finance in each sector and work with the sectors to develop some solutions that we think could overcome those barriers. And when I say coalitions, these are broad groups drawn from finance, industry, policy, academia. Our Energy Efficiency Coalition, for instance, has almost 400 members. So our first coalition was on energy efficiency. That was set up about 2 years ago now. It published a few reports, looking at what the barriers are, suggesting some solutions, and now it's working on making those solutions a reality. So I'll talk through one of them in a second. We've replicated that success across other sectors. So we now have a sector on a coalition on road transport, which launched last year. And this year we launched a new coalition on nature as well. So that's our Financing Green work. On the greening finance side, we lead the technical advisory group on the UK's green taxonomy, which I'll talk through in a bit more detail later. But in effect, the taxonomy is a dictionary of what is green so that we can try and address some of the issues of greenwashing. And we also work on the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures and voluntary carbon markets as well. Next slide, please. So before I dive into some of our products, I was having a think about the title of this series and the issue of deep decarbonisation and what that means for finance. And I was thinking about deep decarbonisation as being at one end of a spectrum. And if you imagine in your minds the standard bell curve you have for adoption of anything, any new idea or technology. On the one hand, you have the innovators, the early adopters, people like Tesla who run with something first of all and are quite a niche thing. Then in the middle, you have the mass adaptation or mass decarbonisation in this context, where those products, those ideas are rolled out to the majority of people. And that's where you see the most progress. And that is where I think our products are focused and the ones I'll talk about in a second. But deep decarbonisation, I think, is a different challenge. That is the far end of the bell curve, the laggards, the difficult challenges that maybe don't fit the same uptake that you could achieve through mass adoption. And I think for finance, that's going to ask some different questions, and there'll be some different business models required that we're not quite at yet. But I'll talk through our products on mass decarbonisation first, and we'll come back to deep decarbonisation in a second. So if I could have the next slide, please. So I'm first going to talk through one of our products on financing green and then one on greening finance. So this is one of the products that came out of our Energy Efficiency Coalition. They're called local climate bonds. And the idea here is very simple. It allows local people to invest in their local area, and it's done through a crowd-funded mechanism whereby the local authority can issue a bond and local people are the investors in it. It's low returns, but also very low risk, and it capitalizes on people that want to have a degree of altruism and see improvements in their local area. So the product is simple. As I said, it's just crowdfunding. You don't need a lot to invest in it. It's low cost. Just a bit of background on this. Normally, local finance in the UK is funded through a mechanism called Public Works Loan Board, or PWLB. And this is an opportunity to be even lower cost, so to make decarbonisation easier for local authorities. It's attractive because it engages with the local community, and it's proven. So if we skip to the next slide, please, you'll see that we've already moved a lot of money on this. We have, I think it may be more than 6 now, this may be out of date, but several councils across the UK have already launched these products, and then the first 3 on the left have closed, they were oversubscribed, that money is being moved and invested in things. And what can be invested in it is broad. So West Berks did a lot of nature-related things with tree planting, Warrington focused on solar, Islington focused more on Islington, very near me here, much more on transport and EV infrastructure. And the live instruments now are still taking funding, again, looking at EVs, energy efficiency, waste upgrades, various different things. And this is the local community improving their own local area and investing in it. And the role for financial institutions here is that this is all done with one of our partners, Abundance, and it's using their investment platform. So it's that innovative thinking from financial institutions to enable new products like this to come forward. And next slide, please. So that was one of our mass products on financing green. There's several others that we have not yet launched, but are working towards launching, some of which are on this slide. So one is demand aggregation finance. This works on the idea of economies of scale. So if you want a solar panel and your whole street is interested in solar panels, you can get everyone to sign up, and then an installer comes and does them all at the same time. And you will get a cheaper solar panel because of the economies of scale of that, and the installer's happy because they get lots of service as well. This is already in operation in the UK. There's a scheme called Solar Together, but we're trying to plug finance into it and get a financial institution that can support this scheme through low interest loans or other types of finance to allow neighbourhoods to install whatever they choose to install. The second scheme, which is property linked finance, one of the work streams that I lead, is similar to PACE finance, which you may have heard of because it's a US thing and it was inspired by the success of PACE finance in the US. Essentially, it involves taking out a loan for any kind of retrofit to your property, be that energy efficiency, EVs, flood resiliency measures, and you can take out a loan for 100% of that cost, but it's attached to the property, not to you as an individual. So it remains with the new owner through transactions. The benefit of that is that you're not worried about not having paid off a loan if you aren't planning on staying in a property for a long time. And the final one, which we're exploring in our transport workstream, is bundled finance. So if you take out a loan for an EV at present, you can pay it off in small monthly repayments. We want to bundle those repayments with a loan for an EV charger and maybe even your electricity supply as well. It's all about making it simpler for the customer and making products that enable the transition to be as easy, as low faff, and as affordable as possible. Next slide, please. So that's all our, or a snippet of some of the things that we are doing on financing green. So next, just an idea on what we're doing on greening finance, because I think this is really important. The taxonomy workstream is, in effect, as I was saying, a dictionary, and it's a dictionary for all economic activities which are classed as green, and it's designed to address greenwashing. So you can't just have a product or a fund or anything anymore and say it's green, because if it's not in the taxonomy, it's not green. It's based on the work that the EU has done. Their taxonomy regulation came into force in 2020. You may have heard it's now well, it's been quite controversial for a while. Last week, the EU voted to allow gas in their taxonomy. So there is some debate about how effective these things are. I think it's important to note that they can be strengthened over time. They're designed to be reviewed. So as they come into force now, over time, they could be strengthened. What is green is tightened, and that is all part of the transition to net zero. But one of the reasons we wanted to make our own taxonomy in the UK is so that we could make it suit what we wanted for net zero. I do not have any insider information on what will be included in it, but the conversation about gas and nuclear and other things will all be had as part of the taxonomy. The UK government was supposed to consult on its environmental objectives for that this year. I don't know if anyone has been following the political situation in the UK. It's a bit up in the air at the moment, but we're hopeful that progress on these crucial things won't be slowed. The GFI role in this is that we chair the independent technical advisory group that provides independent and non-binding advice to government about what should be green. So that's us really trying to plug the finance sectors and experts across industries' views into how we can transition these huge balance sheets that we know banks are trying to transition, how we can make sure that they have a list of things to invest in. Next slide, please. So that's some of the work we're doing on financing green and greening finance. But I feel that they all sit within the mass decarbonisation sphere. And I think if we're going to talk about deep decarbonisation, the topic of this meeting today, there are three things that I think are the key issues that we need to consider a bit more. The first is the last push in current sectors. And the reason there's a picture of some fruit on that box is because a phrase we use here a lot is that we've taken the low-hanging fruit of some of these sectors. If you think about energy efficiency, maybe you've got some loft insulation, you know, it's cheap, it's easy to install, low disruption, great. But getting solid wall insulation on all of our Victorian properties across London, much more difficult. The economies may not work as well. It's a much bigger challenge. And that is what we can't, to get to net zero, we can't just do 80%. We have to get 100% of the way there. So we have to move into these more challenging technologies. It's the same for the power sector in the UK. We've had a very successful policy mechanism called the Contracts for Difference scheme, whereby a strike price is agreed and you get a guaranteed revenue for units of power generated. And that's allowed coal to be completely knocked off the system, well, more or less, and a huge expansion of renewables. But it's probably going to get us to like 60, 80, maybe % renewable penetration on our grid. The last bit is always going to be more difficult. We know that electricity has challenges in balancing supply and demand. And some of that new generation won't be used all the time. It will be used to supply peak demand. And so do we need different business models to make sure that that investment is sufficiently de-risked and there's sufficient confidence in revenue generation for an asset that isn't used all the time? So how do we use finance there? That's one issue. Then the next one is moving into more difficult sectors. So first, we've got transport. We've been quite successful in electric vehicles, that their rollout is doing quite well. And we can maybe draw on that to some parallel sectors like heavy goods vehicles. Maybe there's some similar financial tools we could replicate in that sector. But then there's other aspects of transport which are completely new. Aviation and shipping, as Whitney was talking about, is a big challenge, and we probably can't draw on the parallels we've learned from EVs for that. And then it's the same challenge in the industrial sector. There's a whole new challenge of process emissions. You can't make cement without producing some CO2. It's not just the energy. So you need technologies like carbon capture and storage to decarbonize these sectors. There's a certain amount that you could probably take inspiration from the sectors we've already decarbonized. To what extent could the contracts for difference mechanism that has been so successful for renewables in this country be used for other of these new sectors like carbon capture and storage? Or can you take it as a concept and tweak it and add bits to make sure it suits the finance needs of these other sectors? So that's the second aspect, moving into difficult sectors. And then finally, there's the issue of moving into new geographies. And it doesn't help if we just decarbonize everything in the UK or the US. We need the world to meet net zero. And this is where the issue of territorial and consumption emissions come in. We can't just push our cement manufacturing overseas. And some of these other geographies have particular challenges. I was talking to a bank a few weeks ago who are trying to develop their net zero commitments, and they invest in a lot of high fossil fuels in countries such as Indonesia. And they said, well, if we divest from coal in Indonesia, then a third of the country may be without power. That's not an appropriate thing to do. So this is where the E and the S of ESG both come together. We need to think about how to balance the social and environmental concerns of these countries and do it in a sensitive way to make sure that we achieve true sustainable development And only then, when we can achieve that globally across all these different sectors and the 100% of each sector that we address, can we really get to net zero. That's the deep decarbonisation bit. And I think that's my last slide. Any more? No. Okay. So there's some resources on here if you're interested. I think one of the key things is the UK government is publishing its updated green finance strategy in the autumn. I think the previous green finance strategy didn't just have UK relevance, it had important things that had lean across to other countries in the world. And now that we've got this burgeoning green finance market that we've both talked about, the next steps on how we expand the breadth and the depth of green finance are really important. So we'll be interested to see what's in that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanna, for this great presentation about green finance. For all the great work that is behind Green Finance Institute, not only providing advisory services, but as well creating innovative financial product that really works in the society, as we have seen through your examples. Perfect. So thank you so much. I want to open the floor for questions now. So if you have any questions, please unmute yourself or type them in the main chat. I think that we have some questions. And if not, while the audience think about it, I do have a couple of them. So if you don't mind, Whitney, I would like to start with you. I would like to ask you a question that I'm very curious about. It is, what are the metrics that can make financial institutions more accountable and make sure that they are on track?
Yeah, it's a good question. A great question. Is something that we're actively working on improving, I would say. So I think as of today, the main metric that's used is the finance emissions metric that I was talking about. And so thinking about what is the carbon footprint of the investments and loans that a financial institution has made. So if you're invested in a particular company, what's that company's carbon emissions? And then you attribute those carbon emissions to the financial institution based on what percentage stake they have. So there are different methodologies that make that connection. And so those finance emissions are really important and a really powerful metric for understanding, on the one hand, where does a financial institution have sort of hotspots where they need to decarbonize today, and also to show progress over time. On the other hand, there are some maybe pitfalls of using the finance emissions metric that I think we're actively trying to work out how we can. Are there other metrics used in combination with the finance emissions metric that can show a more complete picture? So the place in particular where the finance emissions metric becomes tricky is when it may discourage investing in some of those sectors or companies that are high emitting today, but that really need finance to become low emitting over time. If you think about the cost of retrofitting a very high emitting plant, you might need some finance that's tied to specific metrics to show that there's progress over time. But so I think the trick will then be, how do we, enable or have metrics that enable investing in those high emitting sectors without any sort of greenwashing. So then showing that there's progress and that those high emitting sectors are making progress towards net zero as a result of that finance. So I think that's that area where there's a lot of work going on right now, and something our team's thinking about.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Whitney. Definitely, there is a lot of work to be done. There is also, I have the hope that we are doing a lot of progress too towards finding the right metrics and getting the financial institutions to follow them. Susanna, I do have another question for you. If you don't mind to ask you, what does sustainability mean for developed and developing countries? And perhaps you can answer this in the context of domestic consumption too.
Yeah, I think here it's really important to remember the original Brundtland report definition of what sustainable development is. It's development that meets the needs of the current generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So we need to steer clear of any suggestions that current generations in developing nations are not allowed to develop because of this crisis in climate that is largely or wholly not of their own making. But saying that, I do think with the right support that developing nations can leapfrog some of the technologies that we've used onto technologies that we understand better, may have completely non-climate benefits like better air quality. If you leapfrog coal and focus on renewables, you will have a much broader benefits than just avoiding emissions. So for financial institutions, they need to balance their social and environmental targets and make sure that their investment in developing nations suits such a transition approach. One product that might be of interest that we've been working on this is called the Green Finance Guarantee Facility. We're very fond of de-risking products and think they're really important to mobilize investment. The key issue here is credit ratings. We know that a lot of development projects of any kind, not necessarily green ones, often have struggle getting access to finance or access to finance that's not prohibitively expensive because of a poor credit rating. And there's several development banks like CEDA and the African Development Bank or the World Bank, or UK has UK Export Finance, that have products specifically designed to provide credit enhancing guarantees. But there aren't really any of those products designed specifically for green guarantees to make sure that green projects can overcome those credit barriers. So that's why we think there's a space in the market for a green guarantee scheme that provides that credit enhancement and allows green projects in developing countries to access the finance they need to go ahead.
That is very interesting about credit ratings, because in some cases they are just objectives and they are blocking some countries to get in the finance they need to channel investments to the right projects. So that's a very good point, Susan. We have some questions from the audience. So the first one is, could Whitney explain, amplify on the current ruling making at the Security Exchange Commission on SCG and relate pushback against? What relationship, if any, is there with developing the metrics you spoke of? Thank you, Martin, for the question.
So the SEC proposed rulemaking on climate disclosures. The SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, just put out rulemaking in, I believe, April, and they had a consultation open for public comment, and that period for public comment just closed. And the SEC has historically always mandated financial disclosures from financial institutions. And in 2010 even, they put out a statement that said it was guidance, not a rulemaking, but guidance on how financial institutions could report on climate-related information if that information was material. And so materiality in the US financial context has a lot of meanings, because material has a lot of meanings in different instances and across jurisdictions. But how the SEC in the US have always typically thought about it was, is this information that had an investor known this about your company and they didn't, they might have invested differently. So sort of, are you withholding information that the investor needs to know to make a sound capital allocation? And 2010, the SEC said, if that information is not financial per se, but is climate related data in nature, so something like the emissions of your portfolio, or how climate related risks, so physical damages to your plants, or if your company is high emissions in nature, you're a fossil fuel company and there's potentially policies that would financially impair your operations, and that's information that an investor would want to know. From 2010 until now, that sort of weak materiality guidance hasn't produced a lot of climate disclosures. And so this year, the proposed rulemaking is more mandatory to say these are the disclosures that you would need to produce that are related to climate. Rulemaking is very long. There are a lot of things within it. So it includes emissions disclosures for companies' scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So their direct emissions that are related to their operations. Their scope 2 emissions are the emissions that are related to the electricity that they purchase to run their operations. And then in some instances, scope 3 emissions, where those emissions of the scope 3 is still on the materiality decision. So if your supply chain emissions or the emissions of use of your product, so if you're a petrol company, emissions related to driving cars versus actually producing the petrol. So there are also, I should say, there are also emissions disclosures or disclosures related to the risks of your emissions, those climate-related physical damages. Also, if you have a transition plan. So a lot of information that the SEC, based on public comment, said this is information that investors would want to know. Right now, I think the SEC has a really tough job of sifting through all of the comments to decide what changes they want to make, if any, to the proposed rulemaking. I think on the one hand, you have a lot of groups saying that the rulemaking doesn't go far enough. And then on the other hand, a lot of groups saying that it may be really difficult to comply with because of perceived challenges with understanding your supply chain or your scope 3 emissions. So I think now the SEC is in a period of deciding what to make mandatory. And this would apply to all public companies registered in the US mainly.
Thank you so much, Whitney. I do have another question for both of you. It comes from you. And she says, right now, it seems that there is still a large gap between current ESG investment and what's needed. Based on your research, do you think will we be able to fill the gap in a near future? And if so, how? And Susanna, you can answer first.
Yeah, thank you. I think we do have a long way to go, but I think we've come a long way as well. And I think the change is accelerating. And although there'll be specific sectors where this isn't true, I think a lot of the time in our conversations with investors, they want to pivot their balance sheet, they want to move money, and they have the challenge that they're struggling to find outlets for their investment because of risk. The overarching issue is risk here. And a lot of these investments need de-risking, and that's where you have the policy and the public-private overlap to allow de-risking mechanisms to allow that balance sheet to move. And the risk can take different forms. It could be technology risk. If it's a new and uncertain technology, it could be policy risk. Are there multiple different options of a policy direction we could go in and the government could change its mind? Or have they come up with a scheme that has some kind of revenue guarantee as part of it that is at risk of disappearing, and then your returns wouldn't be guaranteed anymore? So I think there's a few different ways of mitigating these risks. From a policy point of view, having clear targets, so not just net zero, but things like the phase out date that we have in the UK for new petrol and EV, petrol and diesel EV sales, which have to end by 2030. And other mechanisms that they can bring into place to de-risk. So one is that guarantee mechanism that I was talking about a second ago. That's a key way of de-risking. UK, the contracts for difference mechanism we've had for the power sector that's been so successful. That's another way of de-risking. And then there's some broader things that can be done around regulation and informing investors. But I think a key issue is that, or a key summary is that there is the balance sheet that wants to be pivoted here, and we need to facilitate the money to flow. And a key way of doing that is to come up with mechanisms to de-risk the investment.
Thank you, Susanna. Winnie, can you add to it?
Yeah, I fully agree with what Susanna said. I think a very key part of this is understanding what's the role of the public sector versus the private sector, and how can they play really complementary roles. In the way that the public sector investing is going to be funneling in more private capital to the places that we most need it. I think one other challenge, and I think we are seeing a lot of progress on this, is in translating at the firm level, at the level of a financial institution, translating a high level target into understanding across the firm, what does that net zero by 2050 target mean for each of your asset classes and business units? So what is the role of your lending team versus your private equity team? And how can each of those different kinds of capital play a different kind of role in the transition? Where is there, are there products and services most needed? And how do we figure out how to sort of translate these high level targets into action today? Or just answering the question of how should our particular team sitting within this massive financial institution, what should we be doing tomorrow? So I think that's really where a lot of the center's work is focused on, and taking these, what we've said we'll do in 2050, and then kind of drawing back to where we're going today. I think there's a lot of devils in the details and figuring out things in that regard as well.
Very good points. I have another question, so I'm going to jump while the audience think about other questions. For instance, in the case of me, like a normal customer, if I go to a bank and I ask for a mortgage or an EV loan, how financial institutions can support me as a customer to make a green investment or a green choice? Susanna, can you please answer this one first?
Yeah, of course I can. And I think the first thing is to have those products on offer, because I think if you are going to your
Good
bank
point.
and asking for a green product, you have taken the lead there. You've led your bank, and they need to have something to offer you. I think there'll be a point later on about banks advertising the products to customers and engaging their customers. But I think the first thing has to be to have products available for their customers who want to decarbonize themselves. So there's a few things to flag here, that we're really going beyond the idea of a green product being one that's paperless. You know, if you ask for like a green ISA and they're like, oh, well, we don't send any paper, you know, that's not good enough anymore. A green ISA needs to be one where the funds are ring fenced for green investments. And the same with all the other products that banks offer. If you want to go, if you go into your bank and ask for a green mortgage, then you should hope that your bank has one. And not just a mortgage that's only available to the greenest homes, which is what we've done a lot of work on green mortgages at the Green Finance Institute. We have a green mortgage hub tracking all the products that are available. And we've seen this market grow massively. We've also seen a slight change in direction in that at first, they were basically just mortgages available if you bought a really efficient home. You know, well done you can have a discount on your mortgage. And now we're seeing them be much more about transitioning homes. So you can get mortgages for homes that are less energy efficient. But if you are going to make them more energy efficient, then you get the benefits. And that's a much better product because it's, well, I mean, they're both good products, but it's a product that helps action and progress in net zero. So that's important. And then there's things like green ISAs, green savings accounts, ways in which you can take that huge pool of money that's in consumer bank accounts and direct it to something green and positive. And then there's being involved in new products. So I've mentioned some like the bundled EV finance. Banks currently give out lots of loans and leases for EVs. And we think it will be helpful to come up with new financial products where the charger is bundled in with that. Now, there are issues to do with that about liability and what if you want to return your EV, you can't really return the charger. And it's those questions that we need to work with banks on to make sure these new products are available. So when their customers want to get an EV, want to retrofit their home, the products are available for them. But beyond that, I think there is a point about educating customers too and highlighting to them green products that might help them make green choices.
I have to say that I have to put you in contact with my local bank because unfortunately I don't see this kind of services in the portfolio, and I will definitely advocate for it. Whitney, could you add something, anything else to the question?
Yeah, not much to add there. I think that's exactly it. It's really about making the products and services available that then make the green choice the obvious choice. And to your point, I don't think in most cases we don't have that right now. So as Susanna was laying out, I think it's what is the reason? And I think it's the trick is that it's very specific to each. It's different for EVs or energy efficient homes. The reason that we're not seeing the transition to the greener option, and then how does the financing product correct for that, so that we do have have capital flowing to the greener option. So yeah, very much agree.
Very good point. Thank you so much for answering this question. I don't see questions coming from the audience. Maybe the last one, someone wants to pose the last question, last opportunity. Okay. All right. So I guess this is the end of our session today. Thank you so much, Whitney and Susanna. After having listened to you, it is even more clear to me how important it is that the financial sector achieve net zero goals to speed up the decarbonization of all the sectors of the economy and do the transition we need to a zero carbon and climate resilient economy. The purpose of financial markets is no longer to connect lenders and borrowers, but to facilitate and allocate capital where it is needed by society. And today, society needs to halt the climate change crisis. Thank you very much again. Whitney and Susan has shared the contact information. I want to take the opportunity as well to share the information from Energy Innovation Network. If you want to know more about us, our events and programs, or becoming even a volunteer, we always need extra help for all our events and programs. Please join our Slack channel. And finally, just to wrap up, we will send you a link to a survey, so please fill it up. It will only take a few minutes and it will help us to keep improving in our mission to serve professionals like you. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Bye now.